Vladimir Putin unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe on Ukraine and Europe in 2022. He continues to terrorize the people of Ukraine and target civilian infrastructure, forcing a miserable existence on millions of people and extreme danger for those who are close to the front lines. The Russian targeting of energy infrastructure is explicitly a war crime. Putin is enabled, aided, and abetted by millions of Russians, unfortunately, whether that be actively or passively. But when bad people take control of the agenda, as has so often happened throughout history, good people also arise to show us a better side of humanity. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe to increase the popularity of our content in YouTube's algorithm and to get alerts when we add new content and great new speakers to the channel. Brooks Newmark is a businessman, angel investor, philanthropist, former politician, and social reform campaigner. He was a UK Member of Parliament and served as Minister for Civil Society. He is currently studying for a DPhil at the University of Oxford's Education Department, focusing on education reform in Rwanda. He is also a visiting academic at the Middle East Centre at Oxford University, where he's writing a book on Bashar Assad. But the reason we're talking today is because of his extraordinary work through Angels for Ukraine, an initiative he co-founded to help move thousands of Ukrainian civilians away from the front lines to safety in Western Ukraine. Brooks, welcome to the channel, and I hope I got all of that right.
Yeah, my mother couldn't have done a better job. Thank you for that.
Fantastic. Well, let me dig into your history a little bit. You've had extraordinary range of experiences and influences that have led you to what we're going to discuss.
And you wanted to hear about the various things that have led me to this?
Not all of them, but
but I think
the
key thing
humanitarian
is,
action.
I think the key thing is I'd like to think of myself at least as a problem solver. And whether it's in my business background and my sort of 15 years in private equity, I was at a firm called Apollo, where we would try and turn around businesses, particularly in the early days. But my ambition had always been to work somehow in public service. So rather than sort of stay on in private equity so I could afford that G5 plane, I decided to go into politics. And I was in Parliament between 2005 and 2015. And, as a member of Parliament, there are always issues that you don't imagine emerging that suddenly emerge. And, usually these are from constituents of yours. So, I remember, two campaigns I fought hard on in my early days, both emerged from constituents of mine. One was a woman who had been murdered by her boyfriend, who had been subject to coercive control. And the police at the time, when I would be making complaints, because the neighbors would come to me telling me about it, would say there was nothing that they could do about it. So I pushed very hard in Parliament to effectively criminalize coercive control, which eventually was put into legislation by the then Home Secretary, Theresa May. This sort of second area that, again, I got involved in was another constituent of mine who was quite young, who died of cervical cancer. And in the UK, there was this rule that women, in England rather than the UK broadly, they wouldn't automatically provide a screening for cervical cancer concerns. So I pushed very hard for that legislation, which then sort of went through. Those are sort of two cases in points. I think there's probably a third area that I also got involved in, which was that the Conservative Party, when I arrived in Parliament in 2005, we only had 17 female MPs. And when I'd been in business before, at least a third of the people in the room, bankers, accountants, and so on, were women. And I felt that certainly my party needed to do more to encourage women into Parliament. So I ended up co-founding this organization called Women to Win. And in the 10 years that I was in Parliament, we increased the female representation of my party from 17 up to 68, and it's now 88. So, those are certainly three things I'm proud of. My first experience getting involved in a war zone really was in Syria when the war started in 2011. But because I had been a problem solver, I had felt in the years leading up to that it was very important that we try to engage with Bashar Assad. And so, in fact, I'd spent 5 years between 2006 and 2011 engaging very hard with Bashar Assad, in which I had 9 meetings with him over those 5 years, one-to-one, which is the subject of my book, which is going to be entitled Tea with a Tyrant. Now, I'm always a great believer in engaging, but you need two parties to engage. And I think there were a lot of mistakes made when it came to dealing with Bashar Assad once the civil war happened. But particularly of concern was the red lines that we said that we were drawing with chemical weapons in 2013 that led to first the UK Parliament not agreeing to do anything about it, followed by the US Congress doing likewise. And you can't make threats if you don't carry them out, certainly with the Assads of this world. That then, I think, set a green light, not just for Bashar Assad, but I think more importantly for Putin, which sort of, if we fast forward then to 2014, I think then that Putin got emboldened, not simply to go in to provide support for Bashar Assad, but ultimately to take Crimea, because he felt he could do this with impunity, notwithstanding the rhetoric coming out from the West.
And in fact, there was very little pushback in Crimea. I mean, there was some sanctions, but not substantial.
The same thing in Donbass. So he pushed into not just Crimea, but obviously the eastern part of Ukraine, and again with impunity. So it was not surprising that following his experience with Crimea and Donbass, and we can go before that, whether it's Chechnya or Georgia, that he felt that the West was all talk and no bite. So if we come to 2022, I think he had in his mind he could walk into Ukraine in the same way he did with Crimea earlier, and nothing would happen. He would get no resistance, and the West would bark a lot, but then do nothing. The one thing that we did do that was right, and I'm saying we, the UK, as well as the US, was that following what we saw in 2014, we recognized that the Ukrainian military needed better training and more support. So from the best of my knowledge, we've started putting in a lot of that training in beginning in 2015, which meant that by the time Putin made that huge drive in February 24th this year to push through to Kyiv, he was met with a huge amount of resistance. And as a result of which, the Ukrainians pushed back, and I say pushed back successfully. That then sort of led to where I came into this. So I sort of felt very strongly, I felt a huge sense of failure in Syria, which I put a lot of my emotional baggage into, trying to do the best that I could do with engaging with. And I recognize we also need a stick as well as the positive carrot of engagement. And I felt very strongly, particularly with a character like Putin, the only thing he understands, unfortunately, is strength. And we saw this earlier, a couple of years ago with Erdogan. Erdogan said to Putin, if you keep flying over my territory, I will shoot your planes down. Putin said, Erdogan's part of NATO. There's no way he's going to risk doing that. He continued to provoke. Erdogan shot down one of his planes. Putin jumped up and down. At the end of the day, he did nothing. Actually, what he did was he ended up doing a deal with Erdogan to allow Erdogan into Syria to deal with the threats that he perceived from the Kurds. So I think the conclusion I came to from this is that we have to deal with Putin from strength. And I say this reluctantly because I'm not someone who naturally says, we must go and fight, we must go and fight. But there was an agreement, as many of your listeners will know, in 1993, the Budapest Agreement, which was signed by the UK, the US, and Russia, that said to Ukraine, if you give up your nuclear weapons, and don't forget, in the whole of the Soviet Union, I think they had the second largest stockpile at the time, we will respect and protect your territorial integrity. Your territorial integrity included, I hasten to add, Crimea. Putin threw that away and said, no, I think that was a mistake that we gave Crimea away. I'll create some sort of false referendum, and which he did. The West did nothing. Crimea then was effectively taken over by Russia. And then he pushed for the same in Donbass. And as we saw earlier this year, he had his fake referendums in Zaporizhia and Kherson. And now he's saying, well, these 4 regions, in addition to Crimea, are actually Russian now. And he's using he has this weird legalistic mind that he's legitimizing this in his head through some sort of legal mechanism that says, well, no, they want to be part of us, therefore they should be part of us. So I think that the lesson is we have to deal with him toughly. So the next part of the story is, how did I get engaged? Well, as you said in your introduction, I have been working on my doctorate in education, and I had just finished my field research in Rwanda on February 24th. And I was supposed to be going scuba diving with a friend of mine. And I saw a post from a Latvian friend of mine who was on the border in Poland with a bus moving refugees away from the border. So I sort of decided pretty quickly that I was going to skip my annual dive and go to Poland. So I went back to England, got some warm clothes and went off to Poland and started helping them. We were moving people away from the border and taking them at the time to Berlin and Paris and Luxembourg initially, and then we added Riga to that list. After about 2 weeks, by the end of February, early March, my Latvian friend had to go back to Riga, and I said I'd stay on. So I said, can you find me 3 buses to go into Ukraine? Because there are a lot of people still trying to get away from the tragedy that was still unfolding around Kyiv. So he got me 3 buses from Lithuania because he was in the logistics business. So he understood about buses and bus driving and everything. So he got me 3 buses and 3 bus drivers. So then we started moving people. I went into Ukraine and we started moving people away from Kyiv, mainly to the border where they could get to safety. Once things had settled down there, the Russians had been pushed back. We then moved our operation down to the south, and we moved to Vinnytsia and Zaporizhia, where people who were escaping Mariupol tended to be congregating because they wanted to get away from the war zone. So the next month or so was really moving people away from there. By this stage, I think I'd moved about, I want to say 4,000 or 5,000 people. And as effectively the Russians, in the end, unfortunately got control of Mariupol and the flow of refugees or internally displaced people settled down, that we then moved our operation to Dnipro and to Kharkiv. And I pretty much then spent the next 3 months or so out in the east in Kharkiv, moving people away from Kharkiv to Lviv. And I would say by July, I think I had moved about 7,500 people, continued my work out there. And, if we fast forward to now, I guess the end of 9 months, we now have 8 hubs around the country, beginning with Lviv, Kharkiv, Lviv, Kyiv, and then moving down south to Vinnytsia, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and then Dnipro and Kharkiv. And as I'm sort of on talking to you now, I think the latest statistics, if I can look them up, is we've moved a total of 20,835 women and children primarily away from the war zones to safety. And I've been a sort of victim of my own success, because now I've got 4 of the governorates in Kharkiv, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia who are saying, can you come back now? We may have up to 100,000 people to move over the winter, as the Ukrainian soldiers are pushing the Russians out to pick people up from these towns and small cities and villages to take them to somewhere where they can get some warmth, some safety, and some food. So while I'm here in London at the moment, it was mainly to raise some more money, which is what I have now done. And I'm going back in early January, and will spend really right through till the spring doing what I can to help those 4 regional governorates to move people to safety.
And your operation then has really followed the danger zone, because when you started, Kiev was being encircled. I mean, that wasn't safe. It wasn't clear where the Russians were, where they were not, where they were going to go next, or even whether they would take Kiev. I mean, now it seems improbable that would have happened. But at the time, I think there was a lot of fear. Even Arestovich, Podolyak, and all these in the administration, they were fully expecting to be taken prisoner, and what other consequences were. So a very risky time, but you've followed the danger, haven't you? Through that operation.
I mean, it's not really. I guess it's following the danger, but it's following the danger not because I'm a danger junkie.
No.
It's really because in my head I'm thinking I had this sort of huge drive or something inside of me saying I've got to do something to help these people, and it's very odd, particularly when I was, I spent a lot of time in Kharkiv, and it's not that you hear a bang now and then. It was literally every 2 or 3 minutes you'd hear the missiles firing back and forth to each other. So it sort of becomes white noise. So you don't really notice anything because it becomes background noise. You just sort of go in there and do what you have to do, and that's what I've ended up doing really for the past eight or 9 months. And it's sort of odd. I don't feel the danger. I know I probably should do, but I don't. And maybe that's perhaps what enables me to do what I do.
And when you have a job to do, maybe you can put it to the back of your mind.
I think it's the adrenaline that keeps you going. You keep, God, I got to get those people out there. There's 48 people. I got to get down to this place near Izium. I know there are 48 people there, and I've got to sort of move them. I mean, one of the interesting things was that, clearly, Ukraine is not my backyard. So, once we moved away from Kharkiv to the border, I couldn't use the bus drivers I was using. So I had to develop a relationship with first one national bus company that worked in the west, and then a second bus company that worked in the east, because they know the roads. They will know better than me what's safe, what's not safe, or relatively safe. And the important thing that we ended up doing was we work with local government. So when the local government gets a call that people need picking up, oddly enough, the technology still works pretty well, or has been. So people would go online or use their phones to book effectively a seat on a bus that we said we would be going down to Lazarova or wherever it might be to pick them up. And so we have the list actually of almost every single person that we've picked up and their phone numbers. And what we would do was we would do random spot checks to make sure that they were okay. So we would go down the list and maybe choose a dozen names just to make sure they arrived to wherever they were going to safely. So the numbers that I've got are actual real numbers with real people, and we make sure that they get to where they need to get to securely, because they're not my bus drivers. They're not people that I am. So I sort of feel a sense of responsibility. And most importantly, I want to make sure that no one else has asked them for cash for moving them, which was, again, an early motivation. So when I first went into around Kyiv, people were charging huge amounts of money to people to get out. And I was offering this free service, which then led to another story, which was that when I was trying to move people away from the East originally, I was finding a strange reluctance of people to use something I was offering for free. And the reason why was because people thought if it's for free, maybe I was going to be taking them to Russia. So we ended up doing two things. We ended up creating this idea of registering your name and paying 10 grivni, which is not much, a tiny amount of money. But they felt if they were paying for something, then it must be real. The second thing I did was I did a promotional video in Venezia with a local mayor there and a TV station to show that, I'm from the UK and, we are here to help. And I'd mentioned Boris Johnson's name and we're here to help. And they applaud. It's amazing that how Boris Johnson's brand name, it may not be great in the UK, particularly with everybody, but certainly in Ukraine, he is omnipresent. I mean, even when I was stopped at a roadblock now and then, and they were giving me a hard time, I had a photo of me with Boris Johnson. And if my passport didn't work, certainly the photograph of me with Boris Johnson did help.
I was going to be very facetious and say there's a Boris bust that actually does what it says on the tin.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So yeah, we had to overcome an initial reluctance in the East. The second thing, of course, was the point you were making earlier in the talk that, some of these places we were going were dangerous. And to get some of the bus drivers to go east was not easy. So this is when I just said, look, I am going, who is coming with me? And this is when I had my first four bus drivers who came with me out just when I was in Kharkiv going down south to start collecting people, because I think they felt if I was going, maybe it's sort of okay, which then led to other bus drivers feeling confident and so on.
And that corruption, isn't it? Well, not corruption, but people making a bit of money in the early part of the war. I mean, from my experience of being in Russia, undercutting business like that would have got you killed. Did you have any threats, or did people basically recognize that this was a social necessity and a good?
I think one of the things Putin has done is that he's really brought the Ukrainian people together in a way that they have not been since they split off from the Soviet Union. They were very much a divided society. I mean, when you go to Kharkiv or you go down to Kherson or Mariupol or even Odessa, vast majority of the population spoke Russian. And in certain places, there was a sort of a Russian sympathy. But I think when the Russians came in and started bombing Mariupol and bombing Kherson and bombing Kharkiv, areas of the country which might have been potentially sympathetic to them, they actually united the pro-Russian speakers as one with the more Western Ukrainian speakers. And so he's unified the country in a way that I don't think anybody could have expected. I also do think that this issue of corruption, I think particularly a lot of the very corrupt oligarchs left. And unfortunately, a fish rots from the head downwards. And, I'm not saying there is no corruption there, but certainly the evidence I've seen over 9 months, it's been less corruption and more of the squeaky wheel getting the oil. So there are a lot of soldiers that need body armor. They need equipment, and not everybody can get it. So I think there's a lot of politics now where people are trying to get still relatively limited resources, which is for people to defend themselves. But I certainly, as I said, I'm not seeing the sort of corruption or the level of corruption I was before the war.
I mean, that's an extraordinary change, but also a necessary one for survival, I would have thought. And this impulse that you've got to help, I mean, this doesn't just come from you being a nice person. It doesn't come from nowhere. There is experience in your life and in your family's history that must be a driver when you see these terrible things happening in this part of the world. And I'm thinking here, yes, you've got a connection with Rwanda, but also you've been associated with homelessness initiatives in the UK. But ultimately, the Holocaust must have a huge impact on this motivation that you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of my family history, which was Eastern European, that, I would say, particularly most on my mother's side, um, family were ultimately killed, and those that weren't killed were removed by Stalin to Yakutsk. Um, so I've sort of have family history that was sort of poor treatment, both under the Germans and the Russians. Um, and I think there's this sort of feeling, particularly as a Jew, that there were some people that stuck their neck out for us in our time of need. And I could name whether it's Oskar Schindler or Nicholas Winton, are certainly two names that are in my consciousness growing up. That you sort of think, well, I'm going to do something now, and particularly in Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians historically were not particularly pleasant to the Jews at the Second World War. But that doesn't mean that, the sins of the fathers should not be brought on their children. And I just felt this urge that, it's our time to reciprocate. And particularly when I'm doing my fundraising from my friends in the US, many of whom are Jewish. And I say this, and I say, there were people that stuck their neck out for us, and it's our time to reciprocate. So I sort of try and use that card quite a lot when I'm fundraising. I think there is this need probably within me, a deep psychological need, I suspect, of rescuing. I have this sort of rescue urge in me, which is why you're right. I've been engaged with homelessness actually now for almost 30 years. I've been involved with Rwanda and helping post-genocide to rebuild the education system, which I've been involved in now for over 15 years. And, I hate to see people in a problem. And I think I even look at my own family history, and, my mother grew up in pretty tough circumstances, and this sort of, it's almost like this psychological urge to rescue her from her childhood, even though I obviously could not, to, as an adult, having this sort of need to rescue people. I don't know. I guess that's the way I would put it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think it cuts deep, doesn't it? And I'm not saying people are necessarily going to be indifferent to suffering, but it's quite easy to switch off. And I think war fatigue has really kicked in quite a lot. It's only the extraordinary humor of Ukrainians, their ability to manipulate digital media in a very organic way, not in a propagandist way, that's actually kept this alive in people's consciousness.
And I've got to say, Zelensky's leadership.
And Zelensky's leadership.
He has been a remarkable leader. I mean, almost if anybody else had been there, in the same way I'm going to credit Boris Johnson. If Boris Johnson had not been prime minister at the time, I suspect the Americans wouldn't have been pushed as much as they were to do something. And so I give Boris Johnson huge credit for galvanizing the West behind Ukraine. But more importantly, I give Zelensky, huge credit for his constant leadership and his ability to communicate. And communication with any leader is critical. And his ability to communicate with those people he needs to support, which is, the Europeans, the UK, the Americans in particular, has been a masterclass in leadership.
And transparency, hasn't it? It's extraordinary seeing him really push the boundaries way beyond what normal diplomacy would actually allow, and calling out not necessarily the lies, but calling out the proprietaries of diplomatic behavior that slow things down, and just cutting through all of that is extraordinary.
I also think what's extraordinary actually is if you look at I look at the language of our ambassador, UK ambassador in the United Nations. I look at the language of the US ambassador in the United Nations. They're cutting through it in a way that before they would have been much more diplomatic. You look at the Finnish prime minister and her language. You look at the some of the foreign ministers in the Baltic states. We're seeing a very direct language that we've not seen before, and calling Russia out for what they're doing, which is war crimes, if not genocide. And the way they're going about trying to dismantle Ukraine, its history, its heritage, its culture, is a genocide, and we have to call it out. And I think there's been enormous failings when I look at the United Nations. There's structural failings in which a member of the United Nations Security Council is allowed to do what he is doing with impunity. He is not living up to the rules by which the UN was set up for. So I think when this is over, we need to rethink about how the Security Council is structured, what powers the ICC have to bring people to court. And of course, there are broader issues with this, huge resistance, not only from China and Russia, but I suspect there would be from the likes of the US and Israel too. So, we have to be very careful that if we do want change, which I would like to see, it means you need all parties engaged in doing this.
And that's the extraordinary point, I think, isn't it? Is that despite the Cold War and the friction that existed at the time, Russia was a better observer of international norms than it is now. In a way, they've ripped up the post-war rule book. They've ripped up treaties don't count for anything. As you said earlier, it's strength that counts only. So yes, he can make deals with Turkey, make deals with China, but those deals only stand insofar as they are reinforced with a club or the ability to physically enforce those deals. What does that mean for the international order, and how can we even deal with Putin in any way if choosing, the modes of traditional politics and diplomacy?
No, I mean, I don't think we can do. I mean, my view is Putin reminds me of someone who, a kid goes into a schoolyard and starts sort of hitting somebody, right? A weaker child, and somebody comes in and sort of punches them in the face and says, "Hey, lay off." And the bully is offended, saying, "Well, why are you hitting me?" Putin's the same way. He is, I'm not sure if the technocritical term is sociopath or psychopath, but there is a complete lack of understanding or empathy or anything in this person. The only thing he understands, unfortunately, is violence. And people like Macron, I mean, for hours and hours, he thinks that he can engage with Putin. There is nothing to engage with. Putin's default is for Ukraine, either to capitulate completely to my demands, or I will destroy you. There is nothing sort of in between in Putin's mind. So I think, number one, that he will lose this war, because if you look at his soldiers versus the Ukrainian soldiers are, number one, well motivated, they're well equipped, they're well clothed, they're well fed, and they're well led. The Russians are the flip side of that. They're poorly motivated, poorly equipped, poorly clothed, poorly fed, and poorly led. And one day the equivalent of Sandhurst in Moscow, or wherever it is, this is going to be a masterclass in the failure of Russian military leadership. Or on the flip side, West Point in Sandhurst, that this war will be a great case study on what to do and what not to do. Now, I certainly feel, and I'm more hawkish than most, that we should be standing up right next to the Ukrainians in this war, that we did sign the Budapest Agreement, which did say we would protect your territorial integrity. And while it's not legally binding, it is certainly morally binding. So I would certainly, if not be going in with the Ukrainians, and I think that if we did, we could push the Russians out within about 72 hours. I do not think we will start World War III, because in Putin's legalistic mind, we're not attacking Ukraine, right? Even though he says there have been these referendas, even he knows there are false referendas, then I think that the Americans are right to be careful not to attack Russian land itself. But I think if we went in and we pushed Russia out of Ukraine, Putin would jump up and down, but there wouldn't be much that he could do. Now, I think whether it's next month or in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, Putin is finished. I think he's just digging a hole for himself that's getting deeper and deeper. He can put people, more and more young Russian men, through the meat grinder. I think there's 100,000 so far that are either injured or killed. He could double that, treble that. He doesn't sort of care. But ultimately, there'll be a tipping point, as with Afghanistan, for Russia, where I think the country will have had enough. And he cannot win this war on the ground. And if we can do, which goes back to what am I doing this winter, if there are multiple versions of Brooks Newmark out there going in, doing humanitarian work in Ukraine, to work in parallel to the Ukrainian military and what they're doing, I think if we can get the Ukrainians through this winter, through the cold, through the huge damage that's been done to the infrastructure by supplying generators, fixing the generators, fixing the electricity and so on, get them through till spring, continue to train them, which we're doing in the UK, we're doing in the US, we're doing elsewhere, to get them better and better equipment. I think by certainly this time next year, I would expect to see, much of the, I would say all the Russian gains since February 24th will be gone. And with a bit of luck, I think the Ukrainians will have got much of Donbass back as well. Whether they get Crimea back within a year, I don't know. But certainly mainland Ukraine, I think ultimately they will prevail there. There will be, unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainians will be dying. But from my side, if we can minimize the death toll amongst Ukrainian civilians, to me, that's what's most important.
And it seems like there's a plan forming on the presumption of Ukrainian victory, the rebuilding and really turning Ukraine into a fortress. I mean, realistically, it's going to have to become, an extraordinary, partially militarized society in order to hold the Russians back in future. And it's the new border with Europe. But do we have a plan for Russia? I mean, I see the absence of any real understanding or planning on how to deal with Russia long term.
I think we can't. All we can do is do our best to protect our NATO allies, particularly along the Eastern Front, whether it's Poland, Moldova, the Baltic states, and so on, and doing that. And I think you're right. I think in the end, we will have to, at the end of this war, provide some sort of, even if Ukraine's not in NATO, I hope they are, provide some sort of military protection and guarantees for them, where they can really protect themselves from any form of invasion in the future. I think the problem Russia's got is that it's a kleptocracy, and it's very much driven by one person, as it has been historically. And either it democratizes or it will fragment, or both. And, you could see Russia itself breaking up to another 30, 40, 50 sub-countries. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that is a possibility. The only positive thing I'm going to say is there is a younger generation of Russians who are much more exposed to Western education, the media, social media, and they want to have their place in a broader world. They don't want Russia to become another North Korea or even China to a lesser extent. And, countries need to decide, do they want however uncomfortable democracy is and however messy it is, as we've seen in the UK now, where we've had 3 prime ministers in about 3 months, democracy is uncomfortable. It's messy. The media, can be brutal and unpleasant. But there is a cost to autocracy, and I think over time, we will see a movement to, I still think, a much more democratic Russia, as we will ultimately, I think, a more democratic China. Now, perhaps in my lifetime, I might see a more democratic Russia. It may be not with China, but I can certainly see a movement to that. And the world is split between autocracy versus democracy. But within democracy itself, we've seen the ugly side of democracy with the rise of very populist leaders and the damage that they can do on their own countries, as we've seen in the US, as we've seen in Brazil, as we've seen in the Philippines. This is not a European, UK, US phenomenon. Populism is a global phenomenon. And this is what I lecture in partly, and it's between the haves and have-nots in society. And populist leaders are emerging in democratic states because of the have-nots that have resulted from globalization. And globalization takes a long time to feed through to the broader society. And I think, and this is one thing I always thought that we should be doing in politics when we measure how society is doing. There's this concept of GDP, and then there's this other concept, which I think emerged in Bhutan, called
Happiness Index.
GWB, General Well-Being. And I think what we should be doing is we should be looking at the bottom quartile of society in all our countries and saying, how are they doing? Not the top 1%, because the top 1% can be doing phenomenally, which lifts the whole ship of GDP. But actually, there's still the vast majority of people are falling further and further behind. And while I am a conservative, and while I am a fiscal conservative, but although be it socially liberal, I am learning in my old age that we do need to actually address this problem, is how do we deal not just with the bottom decile in society, which I've focused on hugely, but actually the bottom quartile of society. How do we make sure that they are benefiting from the broader growth that there is going in the global economy?
So the old cliche has it that people get more conservative as they get older. It sounds like you're in an opposite direction, as I found myself in
Unfortunately,
as well.
I was one of those priggish teenagers who was a conservative from a very young age. So you're right. I think with experience, I've learned to moderate that a bit.
Mm-hmm. And my last question really is relate all of these sort of geopolitics back to the personal side. I mean, I myself from 2016 onwards, as you say, with Russian active measures clearly targeting the US and the UK, however effective they were or not, is obviously up for debate. With the rise of demagogues and autocrats, this had a horrible kind of resonance. Anyone who's studied history or anyone whose family, as you say, fled Central or Eastern Europe, as indeed my grandparents did as well. It has this horrible echo from history. And did you sort of feel that on a personal level, a sort of anxiety?
No, I mean, when I look at social media, I do. I mean, I think it's I try to not look at Twitter, for example, but when I do, it does create this anxiety in me, because I read this. What social media has done is let us live on our own echo chambers. And I live in my own intellectual echo chamber on social media. Now and then I dip out of it and I look down the sewer of the other side. And I cannot believe that there are people saying the things they do and the sort of counter narrative of what is going on in the world, whether it's the sort of vaccine skepticism that emerged, in the UK, in Europe, in Africa, in Russia, in China, all these countries that felt that this is some form of state control. I found, shocking. And this is myself. I hate taking any form of medicines or injections, but if there are smart people out there, which I think they were, saying, hey, this vaccine, there's a better chance or not that if you take the vaccine, there's less likelihood you're going to die, I'm going to take it, and it's the same untruths that we were seeing in Syria, for example. I remember getting very angry with some journalists who were writing this counter narrative that somehow the Syrian opposition were gassing their own people. And it's the same thing in this war, that I remember meeting a number of people, Ukrainians, and there are a huge amount of cross relationships between Russian families and Ukrainian families. And the Russian families were calling up their Ukrainian families saying, hey, we're just checking to make sure you're okay. Have our guys gone in to rescue you? And they're saying, we don't want rescuing. And by the way, can you stop, your country bombing our country? They're not bombing your country. That's false. That's fake narrative. That's not true. You mustn't believe that. That is the Ukrainians. They're bombing you themselves. It's not Russian stuff going on. And they're saying, no, it is going on. And, if I hadn't been sort of at the edge of the war zone myself, and, a huge amount of people that I'm picking up are women, and the stories of rape and what these particularly young Russian men are doing. And many of them are doing it under the instructions of their superior officers as a form of hazing. That there was, one woman who told me the story that I think she said she was 41. And there was this 18 and 19-year-old who had been instructed to rape her. And she said they were the age of my, they're young enough to be my children. And, there are other stories about how women are kept in basements and raped with the Russian soldiers saying, we hope we rape you enough that you never want a child again, so we get rid of all the Ukrainians, which is this sort of idea of this sort of genocide of the Ukrainian people by the Russians. And I think the great thing, and there are many things about social media I don't like, but what this war has showed is that we have a minute by minute reconstruction of this war, where we can see exactly what war crimes are going on where and when. And there's video evidence of it daily in a way that we couldn't even see in Syria. And I was amazed with how much evidence there was emerging from Syria. But in this war, every soldier is documenting every minute of what they're doing, in addition, obviously, to their humor and so on. The serious side of war, we're seeing what's going on. And I know that there are some journalists like Janine De Giovanni who are out there with her group who are taking records of these war crimes. And, there will be an immense catalog. And I hope one day that, the Russians are held to account for their war crimes.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a good place to end on, the idea that there will be justice at some point, and history has been patchy in providing that kind of justice. Even after the Second World War in Nuremberg, a lot of people managed to slip the net. I think Russians, their crimes, a lot of them are recorded now in data trails, social media, and even the propagandists themselves. I'm in the unenviable position, speaking Russian, I can actually watch Solovyov and Semyon in the original, and the sort of hateful stuff that you've talked about, the strategy, the genocidal strategy, it's there on the main Russian television channels. I know the number of people tuning into it has dropped consistently through the war, but it's there, right in their mainstream media, the impulse to genocide.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the reality is that many Russians are poorly educated and they believe what they're told. And I think, unlike next door in Belarus, where I think Lukashenko is genuinely unpopular, I do think Putin still is popular with the majority of people. But if they're constantly fed this diet of bile and untruths, it becomes like North Korea. That's all you're receiving. Therefore, it's not surprising that you believe it and you don't want to believe another counter narrative. And by the way, there are even, certainly earlier in the war, when I came back from my initial experiences in Ukraine, and I would show some of my Russian friends in the UK or US some of the photos and stories of things that I'd seen, they just couldn't believe it. They just think in their heads, it was like, it's not possible that Russian men, soldiers, would do these sort of things to other people. And it's because they themselves are living, they've been so encultured into Western society, they've almost forgotten what life is like back home, and the way the media works there, and the way ordinary people are fed a diet of disinformation.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, yes, these things didn't surprise me, but I've had these arguments with Russian friends as well, and I came to the conclusion that many of them don't understand the country that gave birth to them, don't understand, life outside of the main cities, where I did travel quite a lot. It's a fairly brutish place, and it's got worse. The 90s in some ways were probably better for many people than outside of the main cities than it is now. Well, this has been incredible insight. The work you're doing is extraordinary. I hope you get the funding to keep it going and scale it. There's clearly a huge humanitarian need still for it. And I'm so glad you're able to share those stories with our audience, Brooks.
Okay, thank you. And I wish you a happy Hanukkah and a happy Christmas.
Happy Hanukkah, happy Christmas, and Slava
Okay.
Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini.